This video is sponsored by Squarespace.
This was an incredibly difficult film to make. I've been working on it for 7 years, and it felt urgent every day. This film does everything that we are told we are not allowed to do.
Brady Corbet is an intriguing director for The Brutalist, starting off his career as an actor in 2000 with a small role in an episode of The King of Queens.
Oh, my dad's here. I gotta go.
Oh, really? Okay, Stu, take it easy, man.
When I was 7 years old, I happened to move to a small town around 10,000 people that happened to have this very legitimate casting that was happening locally. Because I was such a cinephile, my family encouraged me to audition for films at a young age. Then it kind of took on a life of its own.
Are you okay?
I'm fine.
Mom?
He would continue on acting in both TV and films for about 14 years, with films like 13 and Thunderbirds, and some roles in shows like 24 and Law & Order. During his early transition from actor to director, he would meet Mona Fastvold, a Norwegian filmmaker and actress who he would become friends with and co-write films together with. Before we were ever a couple, we were writing together for years. So back when we were just friends, she convinced me to pick the project back up, The Childhood of a Leader, and finish it. We had new ideas for new characters and new scenarios, so she and I finished it together. Over the years, the two would become more than friends and get married in 2012. She would of course continue to help co-write alongside him, and he would release his first feature film in 2015.
1, 2, 3.
Qu'est-ce qui t'est arrivé à ton joli petit minois?
After I'd made Childhood of a Leader, I was like, what's the most dangerous thing I could possibly do? I just made a film that was set in the earliest 20th century, with a lot of heavy drapery and a very specific period style and tone. I thought the most dangerous thing I could do next is to make a movie about right now.
So, from the public's perspective, this has been an emotional few years for you. Can you tell us what audiences can expect from the new album?
That movie was Vox Lux, a film that was a bit experimental in that it didn't have a second act, only the first and third act. Brady Corbet admitted it was a film that nobody asked for, and that he made almost no money on the project. He did learn some valuable lessons while filming it that would help with his next and most ambitious film yet.
At the time, we were pretty pissed off about an experience that we had just had. I'm sure there's many of you in this room that make movies, and it's complicated because you end up in bed with folks that have very, very different morals and ethics than you do to try to protect the flame of your project.
May I keep these? Of course you may. They're very artistic.
Shortly after Von Lux's debut in September 2018, the director would unveil his plans to take on the story of The Brutalist, a fictional biopic of sorts about a Hungarian-born Jewish architect who immigrates to the US after World War II. The character would flee the fascist hellscape of Nazi Germany, only to encounter capitalism, as the director would say. Now, some of this is interesting because in the past, the director has made known his distaste of covering biopic-like films, saying there's just not a lot of freedom, and there's this annoying thing where there's no way to really do it justice somehow. With this admission, it was fascinating to see this selection for his third feature film, even with it being fictional. But he seemed to find his way around the annoying lack of freedom within a historical piece, by not looking at it in a linear fashion, saying, I think that the medium of cinema is a great way of accessing a feeling for history, which is something that many biographies and biopics really miss by treating history as something linear, as cause and effect, or a series of dates and figures. I don't relate to that conception of history. I'm much more interested in some sort of poetic reimagining with these kinds of things. And while this film is not about a real person, Corbet would go about this biopic-like film by mixing several real-life architects like Marcel Breuer, Paul Rudolph, and others into this one character, fulfilling this idea of treating a biopic like accessing a feeling for history. This way of reimagining history, of course, has its detractors, with many architects being displeased at his portrayal of the brutalist architecture, with one of them deciding the film was just utter tosh at the intermission in an early screening, and yet others declaring the brutalist gets architecture wrong and it perpetuates a colossal cliche. This obviously could not have been a surprise to the director, especially given his ideology around portraying history in films, and the topic he really wanted this story to focus on. The film would focus on that of the immigrant experience, of those who are displaced after tragic and devastating historical events. We usually think about the human lives that were lost, but we rarely think of the livelihoods that were lost. And while the director says he resists interpreting the movies in a political way, the subject matter of the film is all too important with the immigrant crisis in Europe and America, making it important to him to reflect on the immigrant experience and the events that cause it.
In Trump's first term, he had this mandate which was called
Make Federal Buildings Great Again. The order wants all federal buildings to look like Republican Rome or Democratic Athens.
It's interesting because, I'm not sure if he knows who Albert Speer was. He seems to fall right in line with neo-fascist strongman tendencies.
And this perspective from Corbet has added relevance, as even while writing the script for this video, a recently inaugurated Trump has once again reissued the same order, going back against a long-held document created by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who worked for John F. Kennedy at the time, and this document was called The Guiding Principles for Federal Architecture. And since 1962, it has inspired the design of federal architecture under the idea that the development of an official style must be avoided. Design must flow from the architectural profession to the government, and not vice versa. And there are some decent historical, ideological, and philosophical reasons behind that vision. But now, some are worried that this vision is changing. This being said, Trump is hardly the only person who does not care for brutalist architecture, and Corbet would use this perceived controversial style of architecture as a glaring showcase of how something unfamiliar provokes the same feelings from communities to both architecture and to new neighbors like immigrants.
Reject anything which is, at all unfamiliar to them. And for me, the artistic experience, the immigrant experience, is a very similar one. The community is upset about a building that's been erected in town that's unfamiliar and strange. They want it torn down. There's, their new neighbor has a different tradition, different heritage, different skin color than they do, and they want them thrown out.
There are people here. They do not want us here.
This character honors the journey of an artist and how experiences and traumas of war and loss inform and influence the work that is being created. And the beauty of art to be created stemming from some of the darkest times in our world history. And all of that speaks to me as an artist and as a son of a Hungarian immigrant who is an artist in America.
With the story and concept set in motion, it was time to find his cast, initially bringing in Joel Edgerton and Marion Cotillard. The filming was supposed to begin in early 2020, with a shoot happening in Poland, but COVID, of course, would shut down their production quickly. Beyond just the usual issues dealt with by many film productions during the pandemic, they had a lot of other issues surrounding some of their locations, with Poland's tax credits becoming unstable and the war in Ukraine sending Europe into turmoil, forcing them to substitute portions of filming locations from Poland primarily over to Hungary. This resulted in a period of uncertainty, as the director would put it. You know what happens when a house sits on the market too long? It's the same thing with a movie. Between 2020 and 2022, the value of the project dropped by about $5 million. Which, for a film that was made with only a budget of around $10 million, this was a big problem. I definitely knew that the movie was not possible to make for less than $8 million, said the director, but he wasn't interested in making this budget balloon, as he recalled a conversation with a producer who was conservatively estimating that they would need $28 million for this film, to which he replied, "That's bullshit. I mean, that's bullshit. We don't need to make this thing look like Sweeney Todd. The director was confident in his ability to be able to achieve the scale and scope of a much larger budget and production for a fraction of the cost. Most people just couldn't wrap their heads around the ambition of the project. And this small budget was something that would influence a lot of the other production decisions, and that's something we're going to get into later on in this video. But after a few years where it just felt like this film got stuck in the mud, with the several delays at the start of production resulting from the pandemic, several pregnancies within the cast, and deaths within their families, they would finally show some signs of progress early in 2023, signing an almost completely new cast with Adrien Brody, Felicity Jones, Joe Alwyn, and others coming on to star in the film, while the previous cast likely had other obligations that came up over that couple of years. Our sponsor Squarespace is also introducing us to a new way of designing a website with its new design intelligence. And it's a lot easier than learning how to play jazz. The cutting-edge AI technology helps you to create a website that fits your preferred style and brand, but without you having to do all the heavy lifting. With dynamic dashboards, website copy, product descriptions, and a whole lot more, this helps you to easily build a professional, great-looking website to drive clients or customers to. And with Squarespace Payments, you can manage all of your payments in one place with methods like Klarna, ACH Direct Debit, Apple Pay, and more. You can even collect invoice payments from your clients through Squarespace as well, keeping everything in one location. So be sure to try out the awesome new design intelligence system now at squarespace.com. And when you're ready to launch, head to squarespace.com/FrameVoyager to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using the code FrameVoyager. With all the funding barely secured and with all the years of setbacks, production would finally begin on March 16th, 2023 in Budapest, Hungary. But that didn't mean that the weight of trying to keep all of these plates spinning didn't have an impact, leaving the director exhausted. The director would contract pneumonia on the first week of production. Despite getting sick at the wrong time, the director would push on, having an assistant follow him around with an IV bag around the set. Every time either one of us would forget about the IV bag, it would dip below my head and suddenly fill up with blood. I remember we were shooting this sequence set in New York in 1958 with hundreds of extras, a big complicated set piece, and I had lost my voice, and it was just a disastrous day. I could see people were like, who the f*** is this guy? With an assistant walking behind him with an IV. It was pretty absurd. All in all, The Brutalist would take 33 days to film, the longest shoot of the young director's career. He said that it felt like a luxury compared to the previous two movies, just to have a little bit more real estate to work with in terms of planning a schedule. But of course, because this was also longer, the screenplay was about 170 pages, so we had to shoot about 7 pages or so a day. Because of this massive script, they would plan to have an intermission in between, just like many of the films of the past.
I think it's quite silly, actually, to have a conversation about runtime, because that's like criticizing a book for being 700 pages versus 100 pages.
But this intermission wasn't the only feature the film would employ from the past. Beyond just this massive script that they had to film, they had another production wrinkle.
The reason we wanted to shoot the film on that format was for two reasons. One is that it is, of course, a technology that was, that was developed during the time when the movie is set, so that was kind of a no-brainer. But the other thing is that its field of view is quite extraordinary.
There's nothing quite like it. You don't know what it is until you see it, and then when you see it, it's so incredibly enveloping and majestic and rich. It's the difference between seeing the Mona Lisa in person versus a lithograph. A traditional 35mm camera pulls film through the gate vertically, but with VistaVision, it's horizontal. It's pulled through the gate like this, which creates a much wider field of view.
And this is the VistaVision film negative. Twice as big, twice as clear as the old style negative.
The idea to utilize a specific format would interestingly be rooted in the story of the film as well, being inspired by architecture. The director would bring on cinematographer Lal Crowley, who he had worked with on his past films, and he would speak to this saying, photographs of architecture often use lenses that preserve the angles and undistorted lines of the buildings. And VistaVision creates a wider field of view and a higher resolution. So when Brady mentioned it as a way to celebrate architecture and to support the story, it felt perfect.
And so for a film about architecture, it just was sort of a no-brainer. But to try to explain that to dozens, if not hundreds of potential investors, it's a lot of arm twisting.
But this was easier said than done, as there are very few VistaVision cameras left, and though they would get to use the Beaumont VistaVision camera for the film, they had to meticulously plan out their shoots, having just the one VistaVision camera.
We discuss how we will shoot something, and it's a matter of the dance between the camera and the subjects.
They were pretty much using these giant mags and shooting VistaVision as handheld, and Lowell, our DP, is kind of in the room holding this thing.
It's a large format and quite finicky, which requires technicians who know how to work with it, said Corbet. And bringing in technicians they did, including even some that had worked with the format before in 2023's Poor Things. There's still a culture of shooting on the film in Hungary. Unlike much of the rest of the world, for us this was a big coup, and one of the major reasons why I wanted to film in Hungary again. While this is a fascinating process and fits perfectly with the narrative of the film and the look and feel the director was going for, it also brought a ton of headaches in post-production. The long process of getting all of these reels processed. Since our film is nearly the length of 2 films, it required double the film stock. It was a labor-intensive process that required us to really sharpen our pencils and try to figure out a way to do this cost-effectively. They would also finish the film on 70mm reels that would only cost about 1% of the budget.
So 70mm is the only way to see what's on the neg. And so a 35mm print, even though it's beautiful, is down-resing the quality of the image. So 70mm is the only way to see everything that's there.
I really believe that the future of theatrical exhibition is large format. You need to eventize moviegoing so it feels like a night out. I want to send a message to the filmmaking community that large format is available to them even on an independent film. The limited budget of the film also meant that their set designs had to be carefully planned. In most scenes, if you were to move the camera a little bit to the left or right, there was nothing there. We were only designing exactly what we would be seeing so that there wasn't a wasted cent on something that didn't end up in the movie. But the set designs, though they needed to be economical, were crucial in a film about a famous architect. And that's where production designer Judy Becker came in, designing rooms, buildings, furniture, all on an incredibly limited budget.
I designed everything, I had a crew, but it all came from my department. Everything that Laszlo designed was the work of the art department.
Curiously, she had no experience as an architect, but was herself personally drawn to brutalist architecture. I'm always making pilgrimages to those buildings, like Paul Rudolph's futuristic UMass Dartmouth campus. I loved it, even before it started getting popular again. But to pull off brutalistic architecture, you of course have to understand the style of it, but you also need to understand the messaging behind it. One of the things about brutalism and its importance is the void of historical reference, she noted. It's only looking forward, and I think that's one of the reasons people often hate it, like atonal music. It doesn't have anything that they can relate to. And as for Laszlo, that's the point. He is saying goodbye to history and everything he wants to forget.
When I design, I really try to inhabit the characters, and in this case, even more so. And I thought very, very specifically about what would have inspired Laszlo and what he would have been thinking at this time in history after he's come out of a camp, and how that would have influenced his design of the building.
And one of the more interesting designs in the film that kind of plays to that idea is of the Institute, where she would create this massive community center that included a chapel, gymnasium, and a library. In a great trick of cinema, they were able to achieve scale and represent this building without ever showing the entire building.
I started by designing the building and the Institute, and even though I knew we would never build that building, it had to be designed in a way that made sense for the movie and for how it's described in the movie.
So even while not showing off the entire building, what did allow them to pull off such a massive display of architecture on such a small budget? Well, the director attributes that to the brutalist architecture's inherent cinematic design, saying that it uses shapes, forms, and light in a way that we use it. And it helped with the lack of ornamentation throughout the space and as a feature of the architectural style. He would liken this to visual effects 101, saying it is just geometry and space. And while digital visual effects were absolutely necessary throughout this film, as witnessed by the team that's credited with working on the film, the director realized the limitations the budget placed even on that, saying if the film, for example, had been about Venice, then we never would have been able to make it for this amount of money. It would have required 100 VFX artists working 7 days a week for at least 6 months to get that right. It's not super clear what VFX was used for in this film, as is the case in most films. A lot of the VFX content is not released or discussed in as much detail until some time after the film was released, if it's even discussed at all. But for this film, I don't think we have to guess too far that there were probably a lot of set extensions digitally created for it.
I think art needs to move forward and not look back. And I think The Brutalist is a really great example of that.
One of the more interesting production elements of any of the scenes was their day-long shoot of a sex scene. Reportedly, it had to be this long because they were planning on using long exposure shots to make this look almost smeary. Generally, a sex scene is something you do in 20 minutes, Corbet said. But I went to the cast and said, look, we're going to be shooting this sex scene for literally hours. We needed people who were happy to be there, just posing, more like modeling than acting. So that's why we went with body doubles. They would utilize the Arri Flex 435 for this particular sequence, putting it into service mode and the aperture never closing. It streams the highlights, so it just becomes one long stream of film. This idea makes sense in the context of the scene, where both characters essentially are getting high together. Another interesting scene that takes place in Act 2 of the film was this train scene, and it was one that they would tell the director he just wouldn't be able to pull off, saying to him, you know, I think we just have to kill the train station. What if she just pulls up in a car to the estate? The reason they, of course, discussed killing this location was because they would have to fill it up with a ton of extras, adding additional costs on their already tight budget. But the director really wanted this to be the opening scene for the second part of the film, because he wanted it to open with a sense of scope, scale, and breadth. The director downplayed the amount of extras they would need to pull off this scene, saying there could be 45 people on the train. It's not Hogwarts. Production would wrap up on May 5th, 2023, and the real work would begin, sifting through all the footage, editing it out, and then processing it for the release in multiple film formats. Something Brady Corbet would have to handle personally, saying that he had to watch it from start to finish many, many more times than he had any other film. And at this point, he was starting to be ready to be done with this film and move on to something else, saying, I am truly sick of it. I think that you spend so many years dwelling on these themes, on this process, and I just can't wait to have a little bit of mental space free up. The film would finally premiere on September 1st, 2024, and would explode onto the scene, gaining rave reviews and instant picture of the year status. But closer to its wider release in 2025, there would come some controversy around its use of generative AI in the film.
It's just days before Academy Award season really kicks off. A frontrunner is sparking controversy. The editor of the film The Brutalist admitted to using artificial intelligence.
This all coming from an interview with tech magazine Red Shark News, where the editor revealed the use of AI tool Respeecher.
Crafting voices for your creative projects has never been easier. With Respeecher Voice Marketplace, you can create Hollywood-quality voices for your films, TV series, animations, or video games.
They use this to enhance a section of the film where Adrian Brody and Felicity Jones speak in Hungarian, slightly tweaking the words to get the dialect as close as they could to sound natural. Both actors, of course, were on board with using the software, and the editor would explain the use further, saying, we were very careful about keeping their performances. It's mainly just replacing letters here and there. You can do this in Pro Tools yourself, but we had so much dialogue in Hungarian that we really needed to speed up the process. The director would make comments on this as well, saying, there's nothing in the film using AI that hasn't been done before. It just makes the process a lot faster. We use AI to create these tiny little details that we didn't have the money or the time to shoot. Despite this controversy has seemingly gotten away from them and taken on a life of its own, replacing most of the coverage on the film in recent days and resulting in some asking if it should be removed from its place as a Best Picture nominee. It certainly is something that I feel we will start seeing more and more of in the coming years as we see the continued rise of AI. But tell us what you think about that in the comments below, and if you like this video, you'll definitely like our video on NOSFERATU and the amazing production behind that film right here.